Friends, it's a privilege to be in your company. You, the head teachers, principals, and senior educators of schools drawn from 34 countries around the world. And let me say immediately that I think you are our most important people, because to be a Jew is to know that we inherit a civilization whose heroes are teachers, whose citadels are schools, and whose passion is education and the life of the mind. We know that you only change the world by changing people, and you only change people by educating them. The world we build tomorrow is born in the lessons we teach today. So bearing that in mind, let me address the subject you've asked me to speak about. What is it to be a Jew in a troubled world? A world that has seen the return of anti-Semitism to Europe and elsewhere. A world that is seeing ethnic and religious conflict. A world that is seeing a return to hatred, violence, terror, and war. What is it to be a Jew under those circumstances, especially in the light of the Shoah? And here I want to make three very simple points. Number one, what we should be teaching our children is what the victims of the Holocaust died for, we must live for. Ultimately, Judaism is about life. And that is the message that has to come through. Let me tell you how I discovered this. I came quite close to many Holocaust survivors. And I learned from them more than I think I learned from anyone else. And what puzzled me was, how did they survive? Knowing what they knew, seeing what they saw, living with those memories. And I discovered something quite extraordinary. That many of them simply did not speak about their experiences. For years, sometimes for decades, sometimes for 50 years. They didn't speak about it even to their spouses, even to their children. What they did was make themselves a life in a new land. Having lost most of their families, they built new families. They married, they had children, they had jobs. And that is how they built a future for themselves. And only then, years later, sometimes 50 years later, did they turn and remember and share their memories with future generations. From this I learned that if you are a Jew, first you build the future. And only then do you mourn the past. Suddenly I realized the significance of a very famous story in Bereshit chapter 19, where Lot and his family witness the destruction of Sodom, and the angels say to them, "Don't look back." And Lot's wife does look back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. I think the survivors understood that if they looked back, they too would be overcome by the salt of tears, and they would be unable to go on. First build the future, and then you mourn the past. And that is the first thing we must teach our children. What those Jews died for, we must live for, and thus do what we can to bring them or their spirit back to life. The second thing I say, and I say this in all humility as a rabbi, let us not try to explain the Holocaust. When I stood for the first time at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where 1.25 million people were burned and turned to ash, the question that overwhelmed me was not where was God? The question was, where was humanity? The people who designed Der Endlösung, the final solution, came from one of the most civilized lands in Europe, the country of Goethe and Schiller and Bach and Beethoven and Kant and Hegel. Somehow, civilization failed to civilize. Even earlier, if you'd asked at the end of the 19th century what were the epicenters of anti-Semitism in Europe, the answer would have been, among other places, Paris and Vienna, the most civilized centers in the whole of Europe, in the whole of the world. So I suddenly asked myself, where was man? Not where was God? There is a line near the beginning of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, where Moses encounters God for the first time in a burning bush. And God calls to him. And the Torah then says, Vayaste Moshe panav, Moses hid his face. Ki arei mehabit el ha'elokim, because he was afraid to look at God. And my teacher, Reb Nachum Rabinovich, for many years, head of the yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim, gave one of the most extraordinary interpretations I've ever heard of any biblical verse. He said Moses was afraid to look at Elokim, the God of judgment, because if he really looked at the face of God and understood why certain things happened, then he could no longer protest against those things happening. We know sometimes a parent has to make a child cry by having a vaccination. They know, they live with that. Moses didn't want to live with it. Moses didn't want to understand why there is evil in the world, because Moses wanted to fight against evil in the world. We don't try and understand when we see evil. Instead, we fight against it. Almost every other religion the world has ever known has been a religion of acceptance. Thus is the will of God. Judaism is not a religion of acceptance. It's a religion of protest. And the people who protest most are the heroes of faith itself. Avram Avinu said, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat," shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Moses said, "Lama hareot la'am hazeh." Why have you done evil to this people? Jeremiah said, God, I know when I argue with you about justice, I always lose, you always win, but still I want to know, why do the righteous suffer? Why do the wicked prosper? To be a Jew is not to seek justification or explanation for suffering. To be a Jew is to fight against suffering. And out of that protest came this extraordinary phenomenon, that out of all proportion to our numbers, Jews became and still become doctors fighting disease, or lawyers fighting injustice, or educators like you fighting ignorance, or business people fighting poverty, or therapists fighting depression and despair. We don't seek explanations for evil. We seek ways of minimizing and fighting against evil. Don't try and explain the Holocaust. Just try and make us a little more human and a little more capable of fighting evil whenever we see it. And number 3, it becomes terribly important, especially when the world is in a troubled state as it is now. Never ever give way to despair. I'm told, I don't know many Armenians, but I'm told many Armenians never got over their own tragedy which occurred during the years of the First World War, the genocide against the Armenians. If Jews, after the Holocaust, the worst crime of man against man since man first set foot on earth, if they had really sat and wept and mourned and grieved till the end of time, we would understand that. But they didn't do that at all. 3 years after standing eyeball to eyeball with the angel of death at Auschwitz, they proclaimed the State of Israel, the greatest collective affirmation of life in Jewish history in 2,000 years, as a way of saying, on behalf of the whole Jewish people, Lo amut ki ehyeh, I will not die, but I will live and give testimony to the God of life. I believe that the most remarkable Holocaust literature I have ever come across was actually written 26 centuries before the Holocaust. It was set down in writing by the prophet Ezekiel in exile in Babylon. In the 37th chapter of the book that bears his name, he sees the Jewish people in exile as a valley of dry bones. exactly as the Jewish people looked like to the Russians who liberated Auschwitz, or the British who liberated Bergen-Belsen, a valley of dry bones. And God turns to Ezekiel and it says to him, "Shall these bones live?" And Ezekiel said, "I don't know, only you know, O God." And God said, they are saying, "Avda tikvatenu." Our hope is lost. Therefore, says God, I will make these bones live. I will take them out of their graves, and I will bring them back al admat Yisrael, to the land of Israel. And that is what happened. The Jewish people came alive again. 3 years after Auschwitz, the state proclaimed, the Jewish people came back al admat Yisrael. And almost prophetically, Naftali Herz Imber, who wrote the song that became Israel's national anthem, took those words from that chapter of Ezekiel, Avda tikvatenu, and transformed them into the words, Od lo Avda tikvatenu. Our hope is not destroyed. Not yet, not ever. And that is what Israel is, a triumph of life over death, of hope against despair. It is fascinating to me that given all the suffering of Jewish history, from Egypt to Assyria to Babylon to all the persecutions of all the centuries, there is still no Hebrew word for tragedy. There's a word like ason, catastrophe, but tragedy, there is no word. They had to borrow it in the end. Tragedia, essentially from Latin and from Greek. Why? Because tragedy is a situation in which bad things happen because history has no meaning. Because history is, as Joseph Heller of Catch-22 put it, a trash bag of random coincidences blown open in the wind. As the Greeks put it, moira ananke, blind fate. We don't believe that. We believe that history is a journey that has a destination, and so long as we can still walk the journey, we are still on our way. And that is why the key word of Judaism is tikva, hope. Judaism is the principled defeat of tragedy by the power of hope. And the living embodiment of that hope is the state of Israel today. Therefore, however troubled the world is, to be a Jew is to be an agent of hope. And to teach ourselves and the world, uvacharta v'chaim, look forward, not back, and choose life, not death. Those are the three key lessons. But I want to add 3 further observations. Number 1, never ever let us be defined by anti-Semitism. There are too many people for whom Judaism means so little that they only are conscious of themselves as Jews. When somebody makes an anti-Semitic remark or they become part of an anti-Semitic incident, that's all that their identity is. Jean-Paul Sartre once famously said, it isn't Jews who create anti-Semitism, it is anti-Semitism that creates Jews. That is such a wrong turning. Never, ever let that be what we teach people, that to be a Jew is to suffer. Anti-Semitism is what happens to Jews. Anti-Semitism is not what it is to be a Jew. For us, the key phrase is, Ata b'chartanu mikol ha'amim. We are the people whom God loves. We are not the people whom Gentiles hate. We must always, always focus on what is positive in Jewish life and never let us be defeated or overcome or define ourselves in terms of anti-Semitism. Secondly, let us realize that anti-Semitism has significance way beyond Jews. The hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. And there's a reason for this. Jews were hated because they were different. For 1,000 years, they were the most obvious and prominent non-Christian population in a Christian Europe. Today, Israel is the most prominent non-Muslim state in a Muslim Middle East. Jews were hated because they were different. Anti-Semitism is dislike of the unlike. But the truth is, every human being is different. Difference defines our humanity precisely because no human being is exactly like any other. Even identical twins only share 50% of their characteristics. Because we are all different, we are all sacred. Nefesh achad ka'olam maleh. One life is like an entire universe. In our difference lies our humanity. Therefore, any culture or country that has no room for difference has no room for humanity. And that is why we fight, hate, not just because we're Jews, but because, in truth, we're human. And finally, we have to make sure that we are not terrified or haunted or paranoid by the fact that anti-Semitism has returned. The truth is, yes, we have enemies, but we also have friends. Extraordinary friends, really strong friends. I have to say, coming from Britain, that the fight against anti-Semitism in Britain was led by Tony Blair, by Gordon Brown, by David Cameron, and now indeed by Theresa May. That fight has been led by the prime ministers of our country, and indeed the fight is led by parliamentarians, almost all of whom are not Jewish, but who come from every single party. That is important. We are not alone. But more important is the fact that our entire situation has changed. For me, the crucial moment came in the history of the Jewish people in 1938, when leaders of 32 different countries gathered together in the French spa town of Evian, knowing that something dreadful was going to happen to Jews under Nazi Germany. All 32 countries closed their doors to Jews, and that includes the United States, Britain, Australia. And it was at that moment that Jews knew that on the entire surface of the earth, there had not 1 square inch that they could call home in the sense defined by the poet Robert Frost as the place where when you have to go there, they have to let you in. Today we have the state of Israel. Today Jews throughout the world have a home. And therefore, we should not be haunted by fear. We can all walk tall because there is a state of Israel. And therefore, our message should be a positive one. We're defined by our commitment to life, not death. We cling to the dignity of difference on which our very humanity depends. And because of Israel, we walk tall and we walk secure. And yes, we know, as Rav Nachman of Bratslav said, and as every 5-year-old Jewish child knows, Kol halam kulo geshet samod. Life is not easy. It's a very narrow bridge. Vayika shelo lefached klal. But the main thing is never to be afraid. If there is one thing I learned from the Holocaust survivors, it is a passion for life. Uvocharta v'chaim. Choose life. Cherish life. Fight for life. Celebrate life. And sanctify life. And I end with one simple observation. Although we are a people of history, we are the world's first historians. We were the first people to see God in history. There is no Hebrew word for history. Instead, all we have is the word zachor, remember, memory. And we normally think of memory as directed to the past. But it is a fascinating thing that the word vayizkor, and he remembered, appears 3 times in the book of Bereshit, of Genesis. And listen to them. Vayizkor Elokim et Noach, God remembered Noah and took him onto dry land. Vayizkor Elokim et Avraham, God remembered Abraham and saved his nephew Lot. Vayizkar Elokim et Rachel, God remembered Rachel and gave her a child. All three cases are remembering not for the past, but for the future. When we remember as Jews, we do so for the future, because we know we cannot change the past. But if we never forget the Holocaust, we will change the future. Let us do so together and for life. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. I'd like to invite Professor Sergio Della Pergola. Sergio was born in Italy in 1942. He's been living in Israel since 1966. His PhD is from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the former chairman and professor emeritus at the Hebrew University's Hartman Institute of Contemporary Jewry, an internationally recognized specialist in the demography of world Jewry. He's going to give us today an overview of Jewry demography as it stands today.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning. A very hard act to follow after the wonderful words of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. I will try to look at the future with my own means, which is social research. I can only say that I'm very grateful to this invitation. I'm myself a former pupil in a Jewish school in Milano, and for the past 50 years I've been an Israeli, and I try to follow and monitor the trends in world Jewry. So today we'll get a look at world Jewry, present and future. And let's start by mentioning that demography, the study of population, is affected by two main factors. One is the biological, that is birth and death, as in any group, any living population. But the other, which is fundamental in our case, is the cultural elements, the identification, the cultural factors, that is the willingness to be part of a certain group. And this is quite crucial given the current circumstances. So let's look at the main trends in recent years, and let's look at how this can affect our future, the Jewish future. In a rapidly changing and transnational world, in fact, world Jewry lives two different situations. One is that created in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. We have a sovereign state, we have a definite majority within the population of the State of Israel, but the majority of the Jews still live in a diaspora of Jewish communities that represent relatively small minorities within the total population of their societies. Of course, the two situations are totally different, because in Israel, the Jews do have instruments of decision making. They have a government, they have military forces. In other countries, Jews are fundamentally dependent on decisions taken by others. They can influence to some extent public opinion, but certainly they do not lead. And so let's first of all look at some historical trends very quickly. Where did we come from? If we assume that today's Jewish population, and I will explain in a few moments what is definition of the Jewish population currently. A world Jewry of about 14.5 million Jews currently, including Israel and the rest of world Jewry. This was quite different over time, and this graph attempts to explain how it evolved over time. We have a long period when the Jewish population was quite small. The blue line demonstrates the order of magnitude of the number of Jews, and we had probably something like 1 million Jews worldwide during the late Middle Ages and early modern period, which is really very, very few, dispersed, often persecuted, very, very weak economically and politically. And then at the end of the 18th and especially throughout the 19th century, there was a very rapid growth. You see the difference between the rate, the pace of growth of Jews and of the total population, of course with a different scale. Non-Jews represented 1,000 times bigger, but the trends are interesting. The Jewish population grew much faster. That happened especially in Eastern Europe, and that was fundamentally the process of moderate improvement in the standard of living and health standards, lower mortality, higher birth rate, frequent and young marriage, and this brought up the fundamental growth from 1 million, let's say, in 1700 to 16.5 million on the eve of World War II and the Shoah. That's quite exceptional. It is not that rapid population growth is unknown to others, but what happened is that the Jews did it earlier, faster, stronger, and this can be explained quite easily by considering cultural factors. Incidentally, the influence of applying Jewish traditions and commandments can be quite helpful to health, to nutrition, to family hygiene, to community solidarity, and therefore it can have positive effects on population trends. And on the other hand, later, the higher socioeconomic status of Jews, their concentration in towns, and certain relative advantages they might have had over the surrounding populations. So these explanations are quite explainable, although I must also say that uninformed observers at the time when Jewish population was growing very fast introduced the myth of the Jewish race. They gave explanations based on racial differences, imagined of course, and they also projected that if the number of Jews will grow exponentially, endlessly, at some point the Jews will conquer the world, and that will be very dangerous. Of course, if you read the appropriate text, you see how perversely an observation, which was after all scientific, brought to the elaboration of anti-Jewish theories, and finally to the final solution, whose tragic consequences we see on the graph. From theory to fact, stop it. It was stopped. We have the dramatic loss of about 6 million Jews during World War II. And then what we see is a moderate recovery, which I will now elaborate more. The fundamental message is that the world Jewry has never recovered the tragic consequences of Shoah. In a sense, Shoah is a permanent feature still with us. In the future, there might be changes, but Shoah is still present in Jewish demography worldwide. Now, if we look at what, in fact, has happened since World War II, when 11 million Jews were left, to look at the upper line, there has been a moderate recovery, several years of basic stagnation. In more recent years, the number of Jews has been again started growing, but this is due to the totally different trends in Israel and in the diaspora. The blue line in the bottom demonstrates the growth of Jewish population in the state of Israel, where there were about 500,000 Jews in 1945, and there are now about 6.5 million. This has been a growth alimented initially by international migration, aliyah, but in more recent years, especially by the balance between the number of Jewish babies and the number of Jewish deaths. Israel is a relatively young society. The family is still central in this part of the world, and this explains the continuing growth of the Jewish population in Israel, of non-Jews as well, as we shall argue later. But in the diaspora, the green line, the trend has been quite different. There has been quite a lot of stability until the early 1970s, although many Jews were coming from the diaspora to Israel, so there was inherent growth at that time. But more recently, there is actual decline, partly explained by continuing immigration to Israel, and partly explained by an erosion, a loss, an internal diminution, which reflects low birth rates, assimilation, aging, and similar factors. So therefore, as you see, there is a kind of convergence. Still the majority, about 56% of the Jews live out of Israel, about 44% live in Israel, and we shall see how this trend might develop in future years. The current Jewish population distribution is quite interesting when we think of the concept of diaspora, which means, of course, dispersion. In fact, the Jewish people has become enormously concentrated in two places. One is the state of Israel, and one is the United States. We get probably since the last 10 years or so to the point where the Jewish community in Israel has become the largest in the world. Until that point, it was American Jewry, but the rate of growth in this country has become more rapid. And so, based on data about 1 year old, we have about 6.3, 6.4 million today. At the end of 2016, certainly more than 6.5 million Jews in this country. In the US, we have about 5,700,000. Again, I have to explain what's the definition in a moment. But these two big actors have about 85% of the total world Jewry, which means really a lot of concentration, and also means that the dialogue between the two main actors is extremely important so that we can create some better sense of solidarity, mutual understanding. And unfortunately, I must say, by looking at recent political discourse, it's not really the same. American Jewry has to be taken for what it is. It is maybe different from other Jewries, but you cannot say a priori, this is Jewish, this is not Jewish, because I like this denomination and I dislike that denomination. That's a fundamental mistake, and I hope the lesson is learned. That's American Jewry. It has strength, it has weaknesses, but it has to be understood on its own terms. The rest of the world has been now very much reduced. As you see, there is a constellation of different countries. The largest one after the big two is France. The number of Jews in France has been declining because of steady emigration in recent years, reflecting the difficulties, anti-Semitism, the Islamization of the country, politics, also economic factors. And then most of the other countries that you see, and I have displayed about the 20 largest, are now located in Western democracies, unlike in the past when most Jews lived in Eastern Europe and in Islamic societies where the conditions of Jews were inferior. There was discrimination, there wasn't equal opportunity. Today, in reality, the socioeconomic and legal situation of the Jews is quite perhaps the best in history. However, this of course creates the problem of being able to maintain an independent, autonomous identity, group identity. This is a big challenge in open societies. But overall, the westernization of the Jews is very clear from this data. Communities that were important and dominant, like the former Soviet Union, have declined very much. And again, based on the terms of reference that I will illustrate in a moment about what is what I call the core Jewish population. And finally, there are another about 200,000 Jews dispersed across about 80 or 90 countries, small communities. We have to take them seriously. Anywhere a Jewish soul is found, that's important, but it must be clear, and certainly you know that as educators, that you need a minimum critical mass in order to be able to organize services, namely a Jewish school worth of its name. A Jewish school needs a structure, needs pupils, needs teachers, and so you need a minimum of numbers, and you cannot do that until you are above a certain threshold. Now, one of the fundamental mechanisms that has led to this configuration is international migration. Here I have summed up the estimated total Jewish migration across the world, subdivided then into two major streams, with the pale blue, those who came to Eretz Israel and then the State of Israel, and in darker blue, those who went elsewhere. And you have the total of these movements. In fact, quite an enormous number of Jewish migrants has characterized the past 120 or 30 years or so. Nearly 10 million Jews are represented in this diagram. And the interesting thing is the configuration of this diagram. First of all, clearly, the first part is more directed toward the West and especially towards North America. The second part is clearly dominated by migration to Israel. We see that Jewish migration has not been linear. It has been characterized by very important waves, ups and downs, and each of those ups and downs has to be explained. It is explained, first of all, in terms of the different crises that characterized Jewish life in the countries of origin, different countries of origins all the time, and different crises, but crisis after crisis. And this is the underlying mechanism. And also by the opportunity to have access to countries of destinations. Rabbi Sachs just mentioned the tragic moment where all of the doors were closed. And that's certainly a co-participation in the tragedy and in the responsibility of Shoah. So you see that the first big wave is around World War I, at the time when there is reshuffling of geopolitics. America is surging as the big power. The empires in Europe are declining, and they will soon disappear after World War I, and this is a moment of opportunity. The doors of America are open, but in the early 20s they become virtually closed. Then the second wave is with the independence of the State of Israel. Let's not forget that Israel came up thanks, of course, to the gvura, to the heroism of the Jewish people, but also thanks to the fact that the Jewish empire was simply being disbanded. England and the UK could not anymore hold it. And so it's the end of another empire, the British Empire. And then number three, the big exodus from the former Soviet Union, and perhaps metaphorically, that was the end of the Soviet Empire. So end of empires, big opportunities. If you catch it and if you can, you move and you reconfigure completely the Jewish people. Incidentally, the end of the French Empire is also portrayed in the mid-60s. It's not a major wave, but it's very significant. And the underlying lesson is this: Jewish history very much follows its own mechanisms, but Jewish history is fundamentally determined by external factors, by what happens in the world. And so let's follow very carefully what happens in the world. It might be for the better or for the worse. We must be ready to grasp the opportunity if there is a moment of danger and if the opportunity comes. Unfortunately, some of those opportunities now and then were lost. You will also see that in the latest years there is a moderate increase in migration, and this portrays, in fact, what is a certain destabilization of the system, especially in Europe, and that's, of course, a matter of concern. Another mechanism which is important, I will not elaborate on the details, but it is important to realize that in the course of time, from many small villages and dispersed provinces all around the world, Jews have become enormously concentrated in a relatively small number of urban areas, and we have this extraordinary picture today. More than half of the Jewish people, if you look at the right-hand column, more than half of the whole Jewish people live in 5 large metropolitan areas. 3 in the state of Israel, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and 2 in the US, New York and LA. And then if you go down the list, 2/3 of the Jews live in 10 places, and further down, 3/4 of the Jews live in 15 places in the world. This is an extraordinary rate of concentration and urbanization. Again, it offers advantages and disadvantages. The critical mass of large numbers can be a positive factor, although sometimes big numbers in a very confused and confusing large urban area can be also a factor of tiredness. But in any case, this is what we have. The US still quite dominant, and Israel emerging with its largest cities. And the fundamental notion that I wish to convey here today is that unlike what we thought, and we all have believed this, the largest Jewish city in the world is not New York, it is Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv meaning from Netanya to Ashdod. And New York as well means from Connecticut to Pennsylvania. Now the other major factor in the Jewish demography pattern is the family. And here I wish to focus especially on one factor, and it is the choice of partner, whether people marry within or outside the fold of the Jewish community. The example I've chosen is the most important one, numerically, but also sociologically, and that's the United States of America. Here you see how the frequency of Jews intermarrying has changed over the 20th century and in the course of the beginning of the 21st century. At the beginning of the century, it was nearly non-existent, 1%, 2%, and still, around 1960, which is perhaps more interesting, it still was around 5%, very, very low rate of intermarriage as compared to what already was going on in European societies. But then since the 1960s, you have a very rapid takeoff. The curve is based on different surveys, but you see that overall the trend is very clear. It crosses 30% around the 1970s, 40% around 1980s, and 50% around the 1990s. And in 2013, the Pew Survey of American Jews, or in fact, as it is called, of Jewish Americans, gives 58% of intermarriage, and if you take out the Orthodox minority of the Jewish population, it is about 72% intermarriage among the majority of non-Orthodox in the US. This is an incredibly high percentage, the consequences of which we shall examine in a moment. But I just want to add one further consideration. We were used to think that the large number of American Jews and the critical mass of their community will produce a sort of defense against assimilation, because if you just meet a person at random in a large place like New York or Los Angeles, the likelihood that you are meeting a Jew without knowing is very high. There are so many Jews in town. But this is no more sufficient to prevent intermarriage from growing. You see 4 points to the right hand. The top one is the Russian Republic, which has a higher percent of intermarriage, but this can be explained historically by the deprivation and the lack of opportunity that for tens of years characterized the impossibility of that community to have its own schools, its own structure. The process has started only very late, and it is recovering. And then you have France in blue, which is about 1/10 or less than the Jewish community in the US, and it has quite a lower, although higher than in the past, a rate of intermarriage. Canada, which is very close and still smaller, with an even smaller rate of intermarriage. And then the extreme case in orange of Mexico, which is a small community of 40 to 50,000 persons, but very well structured, with a strong sense of community, with probably the best Jewish education structure, with the highest rate of enrollment in Jewish schools in the diaspora. And you see, therefore, that the differences are not explained by numbers. They are explained by the institutional and sociological capability of a community to take its history into its hands, and this is a very important lesson. Now, to the question which follows after that high rate of intermarriage of who is a Jew, the truth is that the situation has become very complicated, because what we have usually believed, namely that the world since creation is clearly divided into two, Jews and non-Jews. That was a nice portrait. It ain't anymore like that. It is now continuum where you have so many different nuances and configurations. And so at the center you have the stronger core, which includes people who say, okay, I'm Jewish, Judaism is a religion, I basically accept that's my religion, regardless of the intensity of knowledge and participation, but that's the basic framework. And that's, I would say, still the majority of current Jews. Then let's call them only Jewish by religion. The second group is only Jewish, no religion. I'm Jewish and nothing else. Not interested in religion, I'm secular. Still, I can be a strong Jew by nationality, ethnicity, culture, and organization. And so these two groups make up what I call the core Jewish population. And these are the numbers that I have portrayed in my previous diagrams. But then you have other options. You have a group of people who say, I'm also Jewish. I'm Jewish and non-Jewish. In the United States of America, the Pew Survey shows 1 million persons who say, I'm partly Jewish. That is partly something else. And that something else is meaningful to me. I'll not give up on that other. And you can include them or not include them. I did not in my data. Some of my colleagues do. 1 million more would bring the US to a more respectable 6.7 millions rather than 5.7 millions, as I told. And then you have another group called Jewish Connected. People who say, I'm not Jewish, but I have strong family connections with Jews. I am the husband of a Jewish woman or the wife of a Jewish man. I am the non-Jewish child of a Jewish parent. We have strong connections. We cannot delete those. So we have a concept of an enlarged sociological Jewish population. And finally, you have an interesting circle of people who say, I find a certain sense of affinity with Judaism. I'm not Jewish, but maybe my ancestors were, and I will just mention one example which is becoming more and more relevant, especially in the Latino world, descendants of ancient conversos who now come to the light and think they would like to return to Judaism, participate, whether formally or not formally converting. This is something that, according to a very, very rough calculation, I did take it very, very cautiously, might involve something between 40 and 50 million Latinos between the Iberian Peninsula, Central and Southern America. Many of them are not aware of this, but some are, and some are in fact actively involved. Therefore, you have a very complex typology with significant passages day by day from one stage to another. And the portrayal of a Jewish population is more complex, but this is what it is. By subdividing this into the major regions, you have the United States with an enormous enlargement because of the high rate of intermarriage. Israel less, because migration to Israel has been quite selective. There are about 400,000 non-Jews who have been incorporated through the law of return into Israeli society. Functionally, they are Jewish by any means. Nobody can tell who is what. But according to the law, they still have a separate status, especially on personal matters. And finally, the rest of the Jewish population. I'm saying that the difference between the 14.5 million Jews that I define as the core Jewish population, the darker blue, and the expanded by the law of return is no less than 9 million additional individuals. And all of this without including the more peripheral circles of those who feel some sense of connectiveness or affinity with the Jews. Now Jewish identity, which is becoming more and more the fundamental driver of these trends. Let me first say one word about the obvious fact that there is no one identity. Each of us acts, circulates, performs, believes as part of different groups of people. One fundamental sense of sharing that I believe we all have is a sense of being part of a family circle. And then we may, and each of us has a certain geographical, political space where they live. It can be the state, the country, the political entity of which they are the citizens. And then what is of interest to us is the allegiance and the feeling of belonging with a specific religious and or ethnic group, given the case we are talking of the Jews. But that's not all. Today, it is very significant also to be a part of a certain socioeconomic or class or professional group. And if you check your daily emails or WhatsApps or SMSs, make the following statistics. How many of these are members of my family? How many of these are members of my country? How many of these are members of my religion/ethnicity? And how many of these are members of my profession, maybe in a different country? And you will see that you have a blend of all of these. And this is just to say that identities, on one hand, can be very strong and inclusive, but on the other hand, they can also be in competition, one with another. So the question is, how does Jewish identity perform in the competition with or against other relevant identities? What we can say is that in terms of the configuration of Jewish identity, based on a lot of empirical data, and this is, believe me or not, this is the graphical synthesis of huge statistical tables and lots of correlations and very gray and boring numbers, we learn a very fundamental message. Jewish identity in the United States, in Israel, in Latin America, in France, in Italy, wherever, even in Eastern Europe, wherever we have investigated the matter, is not a linear thing, is not a single variable. It is an articulation of different options. And the different options have a certain logical connection, the ones with the others. As I mentioned, family and life cycle are very important moments of aggregation and of participation and of feeling Jewish. And next, family life cycle is of course related to the normative beliefs and behaviors and adherence to commandments the ritual religious part, which in turn is related to learning, knowledge, education, knowing, which in turn is related to philanthropy, organization, activism, participation, voluntarism. All of these are typical functions of a Jew, of a contemporary Jew, which in turn is related to militating within civil society. That is, bringing Jewish values into the arena where general issues like civil rights and also combating anti-Semitism, for that matter, are centrally located. And finally, there is one further option, which is being in a sense of solidarity with the State of Israel, understanding its needs, and participating, therefore, Israel as a motivating factor in Jewish identity. What is important to realize is that all of this revolves around one general sense of Jewish peoplehood. The question which I would presume is the fundamental one, if I have to ask only one question in a survey, is do you feel part of the Jewish people? This is the stronger predictor of what will happen in the next generation. And I think as educators, we must be aware that each of us can specialize in any of the options that I mentioned here, but keep in mind that the central option is that of being Jewish. I will now, since the chair signals that time is diminishing, I will move to a number of short conclusions. The first thing is that because of the processes I have outlined, the trend of Israel to grow will presumably continue if there are no major dramas and major changes, that is, presuming the world will continue to develop more or less as we know, which is a strong and dangerous assumption. I recognize that. We have seen the dramatic ups and downs of Jewish history. But if things continue as they are, we might reach a point, and this is distant to something like 20 to 25 years, or maybe even less, the point where the majority of the Jewish population might be concentrated in the State of Israel. That would be a moment of great import, sociologically, demographically, but also from the point of view of the Jewish halacha. I will not elaborate on that. If the majority of Jews live in the land of Israel or not, these are two different worlds. We might get to that point in the near future. Another thing is that looking at Israeli society, let's not forget that Israeli society is not totally uniform. There are more religious Jews, less religious Jews, and there are Arabs who are citizens of the State of Israel. And in the future, what we see is a steady growth of all of the groups, but the proportion of those who are either more religious or non-Jewish will increase vis-a-vis what it is now, and that's, of course, a challenge regarding the future of the State of Israel. And in conclusion, let me read with you a number of short statements. The first statement is that Jews at the moment face unprecedented challenges, existential challenges that reflect cultural, social, political changes, and we see them day by day in front of us at the global, at the regional, at the local level. So let's be aware that all of this does and will affect the demographic equation. Jews out of Israel face the challenge of how to keep a cohesive and meaningful community framework, which is unique and attractive and significant culturally, spiritually, while enjoying the manifold opportunities offered by open societies. No more ghettos, no more walls, it's an open society, how we enjoy that and at the same time remain ourselves. In Israel, the big challenge is different. The challenge is how to preserve a clear, undisputed Jewish majority in the State of Israel, so that Israel can continue to be a Jewish state that is the heart of Jewish peoplehood in the land of Israel, while at the same time keeping its configuration as a democracy where every citizen is treated equally by the law. The great challenge, to conclude, is that we have seen, and we will see more in the future, this dilemma, to be a Jewish peoplehood of presence. That is, you are where the conditions are good, where the markets are favorable, where the laws are easier, and where you can stay somewhat anonymously, and nobody is chasing after you. But you are dependent on the framework that others have decided, or to be a Jewish people who have contains creativity and freedom of choice, where you choose and you determine the rules of your own behavior, of your own framework, and of your Jewishness. And so let me conclude by saying that Akol Yadua, everything is known, Aval Abrera Netuna, the choice is ours. Thank you.
Sergio, thank you very much. You confused us, but thank you very much. And I know that people are asking, I'm getting tweets about different presentations, Rabbi Sachs's video, Sergio's presentation, Shudamit's presentation yesterday, Eyal's presentation. We intend to put their presentations up over the Vashem conference website. There'll be, we can get them ready to print, another line below that, conference presentations, and hopefully it'll be today or tomorrow, and you'll be able to access all those materials for yourselves. Thank you very much. Professor Irwin Cotler. Professor Irwin Cotler is the founder and the chair of the Rao Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former member of the Parliament, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional comparative law scholar, Professor Cotler intervened in landmark Charter of Rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. He was elected in 2014 as a Canadian Parliamentarian of the Year by his colleagues and recently received the Law Society of Upper Canada's inaugural Human Rights Award. Irwin, please.
Thank you, Ephraim. I'm delighted, as Rabbi Sachs said in his opening words, to be here in the presence of educators, of mechanchim. Indeed, we can say it best here today that mikol namdai hiskalti, that I've learned from whoever I have been in the company and the presence of. And being here these last 2 days has been, for me, very much of a learning experience, and I hope to share some of that learning in the context of my remarks. As it happens, we meet on the hill of remembrance alongside the valleys of remembrance, and I would say at an important historical moment of remembrance and reminder of bearing witness and of taking action. For we meet on the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th, itself established to commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, reminding us of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. And we meet also in the aftermath of the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg race laws, which institutionalized the state-sanctioned racism and anti-Semitism of the Nazi regime, which began in 1933, and which became prologue and precursor to the Shoah. And we meet also on the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, which became the foundation for the development of international humanitarian and criminal law. And so it was that on the occasion of these anniversaries, we met on the eve of the March of the Living last May in Jagiellonian University in Poland for an international legal symposium on the theme of the double entendre of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg of hate and the Nuremberg of judgments. But we knew also that we were meeting at a time, and Rabbi Sachs gave expression to it, that we were meeting at a time in our own time of never again becoming yet again and again, becoming more of an idle slogan than in fact an instruction and moral imperative to act upon. And so as we did at that symposium in Nuremberg, where we unanimously adopted a never again declaration, a series not only of lessons to be learned from the Shoah, but the undertakings to be acted upon. What I would like to do is share with you today some of these lessons and some of these undertakings. The whole underpinned, if you will, by Jewish identity, by Jewish values which inform those lessons, and by Jewish values that inspire and instruct the undertakings, the Maasim Tovim, the good deeds that we must undertake. I always remember when I speak of Maasim Tovim, the teachings of Harambam Maimonides, who said we should each see the world as being divided into half evil and half good. Therefore, one good deed by any one of us on any given day can transform the scale in a cosmic sense from evil to good. And that is why I share the approach taken by Rabbi Sachs, that if humanity was responsible for the Shoah in their inhumanity, our humanity can transform the universe today. So let me now try to share with you those lessons to be learned and action to be taken that found expression in our Never Again declaration, and share them with you today. The first lesson, and appropriately enough, being here at Yad Vashem on this hill of remembrance, the first lesson is the importance, indeed the imperative, of Zachor. Le devoir de mémoire, as the French would put it, the duty of remembrance. Of the Holocaust, as Elie put it so memorably and so compellingly, as a war against the Jews in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims. Of the remembrance of victims defamed, demonized, dehumanized as prologue and justification for their mass murder. Of the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews, not just to be remembered as a matter of abstract statistics, but as we always say on such moments of remembrance, that unto each person there is a name, each person is an identity, each person is a universe. As our sages teach us, Hametzil Adam Achad, Kilo Itzil Olam Kulo. That if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. Just as if you kill a single person, it is as if you have killed an entire universe. And so the abiding lesson that emerges from this first imperative of Zachor, that we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. Again, informed and underpinned by Jewish values. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. And as the novelist Milan Kundera put it as well, that the struggle of memory against forgetting is a struggle of freedom against tyranny. And guarding in forgetting, as Elie Wiesel would remind us again, of not being acquiescent into killing the victims a second time. A second lesson is the danger of anti-Semitism and the responsibility to combat it. I share here again what Rabbi Sachs said. We cannot allow anti-Semitism to define our identity. But we cannot ignore the history of anti-Semitism and the lessons to be learned from it. If the Shoah is a metaphor for radical evil, then anti-Semitism, the oldest and most enduring and most toxic of hatreds, is a metaphor for radical hatred. From 1940 to early 1945, 1.3 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. It remains today the canary in the global mineshaft of evil. And as we have learned too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And as we meet, we have been witnessing and experiencing for some time now an old, new, escalating, global, sophisticated, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, which first found its institutional and international juridical expression in the United Nations Zionism is Racism Resolution of 1975, but has gone dramatically beyond it. A new anti-Semitism for which we almost need a new definition to describe it, but which can best be described as a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations, the right even to live. In other words, traditional anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in any society and state they inhabit. And we have developed a series of metrics or measures to identify, if not evaluate, this traditional anti-Semitism. And so it was that in 2014, the Anti-Defamation League identified some 11 metrics of traditional anti-Semitism, things that do the Jews have too much power, do they control the media, etc., and concluded after a global analysis that anti-Semitism was a persistent and pervasive virus. But in identifying the metrics of anti-Semitism, they were speaking of traditional anti-Semitism. There is this new anti-Semitism that I mentioned, for which we have yet to properly develop metrics of identification and evaluation. I have written elsewhere about it. These metrics including things such as genocidal anti-Semitism, the convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most enduring of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, and targeting Israel and the Jews in the public call for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be, finding expression and manifestation in anti-Jewish terror and the like. Or in the demonization of Israel and the Jewish people, in ascribing to Israel and the Jews all of the evils of the 20th century, of colonialism and imperialism. You know what I mean. The purpose being to demonstrate that Israel is the enemy of all that is good and the repository of all that is evil. And there are other metrics, but I want to only give expression and definition to one of them, because it's the most sophisticated and therefore perhaps even the most pernicious and the one that we are experiencing wherever we are. I'm referring to the laundering or masking or shielding of anti-Semitism, more as a phenomenon in the framework of delegitimization, but the laundering or shielding of it under universal public values. Those values being the protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, the struggle against racism. In a world in which these universal public values and human rights in particular has emerged as the new secular religion of our time, and this I wrote about some 40 years ago, then the characterization of Israel as the enemy of these universal public values, as the enemy of human rights, means that Israel emerges as the new geopolitical antichrist of our time. And let me just give you one example under each of those universal public values. As a Canadian who grew up with the United Nations as part of our DNA, though it was very much a part of Jewish DNA as well, with regard to the founders and the crafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its infusion with Jewish values, where international law is a centerpiece of our identity, human rights an organizing idiom of our foreign policy, the struggle against racism, a framework of my responsibility as Minister of Justice and Attorney General. These four universal values have a compelling claim, if you will, today on the conscience of humankind. But what is happening is the laundering of anti-Semitism under each of these four values. And so under the protective cover of the UN, as we meet, the United Nations General Assembly yet again has adopted 20 resolutions of condemnation against one member state of the international community, that happens to be Israel, and 4 resolutions against the rest of the world community combined. Thereby not only singling out one state for differential and discriminatory indictment, but giving the major human rights violators, be they Russia or China or Iran and the like, exculpatory immunity. A second example, and that is laundering under the authority of international law. Some 2 years ago, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, considered to be the repository of international humanitarian law, met to put one state in the docket for its war crimes and crimes against humanity. The only state put in the docket was Israel. In the last 50 years, 3 states have been put into the docket for violation of international humanitarian law. In each and every one of these cases, that state was Israel. Again, this obsessive and selective and prejudicial preoccupation with one state, giving exculpatory immunity to the international community and the major violators therein. The third was laundering into the culture of human rights. Whereas we meet, it's the 70th anniversary of the first UN Commission, and now today its successor, the United Nations Council on Human Rights, considered to be the repository for standard setting and implementation in matters of human rights. Apart from the fact that here too, a majority of the resolutions have singled out one state, and you know which one I mean. And apart from the fact that yet again and again and again, the major human rights violators have enjoyed exculpatory immunity. What is not so well known, and as someone who has appeared before the UN Human Rights Council as witnesses, is that at every meeting of that UN Human Rights Council, it begins with an agenda item that speaks of Israeli human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories. There's another agenda item which speaks about human rights violations in the rest of the world. But you have one agenda-specific item indicting one member state, an Alice in Wonderland situation where the conviction is secured even before the investigation begins. And finally, laundering under the struggle against racism. Let there be no mistake about it here. Apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. If you say Israel is an apartheid state, you are saying it's a crime against humanity. If it's a crime against humanity, then it has no right to be. And if that is not enough, then you say also that it is a Nazi state. Not only, therefore, that it has no right to be, that what we have is an obligation to dismantle. And that is where feeding off this laundering of delegitimization under universal public values that the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, takes its own inspiration. And as somebody who was present at the World Conference Against Racism held in Durban in 2001, and as someone who was one of the supporters in the late 90s of that conference being held in the place of the legacy of the anti-apartheid movement, where we were celebrating that the first World Conference on Human Rights in the 21st century would be a World Conference against racism. Well, that World Conference against racism turned into, as you know, a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people. And the tipping point for the laundering of delegitimization of the universal public values and the blueprint for was set forth in Durban, including for the BDS movement. Let me go now to a third message and move much more quickly. The third is the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide and the responsibility to prevent it. The Holocaust and the genocides that followed occurred not simply because of the industry of death, but because of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide. It is this teaching of hate, this demonizing of the other, of which the Shoah is message and metaphor, this is where it all begins. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it so well, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chamber, said the court. It began with words. These are the catastrophic effects of racism, said the court. These are the chilling facts of history. And in a memorable judgment some 11 years ago in the Mugesera case, where Leon Mugesera was a Rwandan who had come to Canada in 1992 and sought refugee status. And when he was subsequently prosecuted for crimes against humanity in Rwanda because of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, he said, how can I be accused of crimes against humanity? I came here in 1992. The genocide in Rwanda occurred in 1994. Well, the court found that he had been responsible for inciting to genocide in the early 90s in Rwanda. And in an important principle and precedent said that the very incitement to genocide itself constitutes the crime under the Genocide Convention, whether or not acts of genocide subsequently follow. And this is an important lesson for us as educators, not only in the teachings in the classroom, but in terms of responsibilities of states. That those who incite to hate and to genocide must be held to account. And there's international law, principle, and precedent for that purpose. A fourth lesson is the danger of Holocaust denial. Of the Holocaust denial movement as expression of both the old and the new anti-Semitism. As Ephraim K. has written so compellingly about it, I will not seek to enlarge upon it other than to say that we have a responsibility in the matters of Holocaust denial to unmask the bearers of false witness, that we have a responsibility to expose the criminality of the deniers as we protect the dignity of their victims. And today, not only in terms of Holocaust denial, but also in terms of Holocaust inversion with respect to the Nazification of Israel and the Jewish people. Which leads me to a fifth important lesson and responsibility. And that is the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity and genocide, and the responsibility that we have, not only in terms of our own Jewish values and tradition, lo ta'amod al dam re'acha, but that has been translated into the contemporary responsibility to protect a doctrine. Indeed, what makes the Shoah and Rwanda, now with 22nd anniversary of the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, what makes this genocide so unspeakable is not only the horror of the Shoah, not only the horror of the genocide in Rwanda itself. What makes them so unspeakable is that they were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as in the case of Darfur, nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as in the case of Syria, nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And we are approaching now, in March, it'll be the 6th anniversary of horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity, which have left more than 500,000 dead. Some 12 million Syrians displaced, more than half of the population, more than 5 million refugees. But what makes these horrors, again, so unspeakable is that they were preventable. You know, it began in March 2011 with some peaceful protests by young people in Syria. And I had been in Syria, I had spent time there over the years, and I felt when the Arab Spring began, as it were, that in Syria there was actually the possibility of the emergence of a community of minorities, a community who did have a feeling for, because of their suffering under the father of Assad and now again, of the need for creating a civil society anchored in democratization and the like. But when these young people came to protest, they were disappeared and gunned down. Those who came to support them were themselves disappeared and murdered. And so in March 2011 began the Assad regime scorched earth policy. The end of 2011, there were quote unquote only 7,000 dead. Only quote unquote some 10,000 that were displaced. Those of us who called at the time, under the rubric, if you will, of lo ta'amod al dam re'acha, of a responsibility to protect, a document which says that where war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed, and the country in which they are being committed, the government is unable or unwilling to do anything about it, or as in the case of Syria, is the author of that criminality, then there's a responsibility on behalf of the international community to intervene. Well, those of us who called for intervention to protect the civilians were told, you know, if you intervene, this will lead to sectarian warfare, this will lead to civil war in Syria, this will lead to jihadists coming in. Everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we did intervene. And so the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity, of the compelling importance of appreciating that fundamental Jewish value of lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. Which brings me now to the sixth lesson, in that regard. And that is the danger of impunity, which we have seen in Syria and elsewhere, and the imperative of bringing war criminals to justice. If the 20th century, symbolized by the Shoah, was the age of atrocity, it was also the age of impunity. Few of the perpetrators were brought to justice. And that is held true with regard to atrocities in the 21st century. And so, just as there must be no sanctuary for hate, no refuge for bigotry, so must there be no sanctuary for these hostis humanus generis, these enemies of humankind, who must be brought to justice. Otherwise, by allowing, if not fostering, a culture of impunity, we then embolden and encourage more war crimes and more war criminals. A seventh lesson is the trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the elites, the responsibility, as Elie Wiesel demonstrated again and again, of the responsibility that we have to speak truth to power. The Holocaust was made possible not only because of the bureaucratization of genocide, as Robert Lifton called it, of which Adolf Eichmann was himself the paradigm example, but because of la trahison des clercs, the complicity of the elites. Physicians, doctors, lawyers, judges, church leaders, engineers, architects, educators, and the like. In other words, the Shoah and Holocaust crimes were the crimes of the Nuremberg elites. Again, as Elie Wiesel put it, it demonstrated that one could like music and at the same time kill children. And so it is our responsibility always to speak truth to power and to hold power accountable to truth. The double entendre of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg of hate, as well as the Nuremberg of judgments, must be part of our learning and part of our legacy. And that is why, in the wake of the UN Security Council resolution last week, here too we must speak truth to power. This is not just a resolution about settlements. This is a resolution, if one were to read it, that effectively seeks to make of Jews living in East Jerusalem criminals and outlaws, of those living in Gush Etzion criminals and outlaws. And I say this because while I've sometimes been a critic of settlement policy, there is a difference when you have a situation where places like Gush Etzion and the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself, from time immemorial, to go ahead and seek to criminalize East Jerusalem, Gush Etzion, etc., at a time when the International Criminal Court is considering the whole question of whether to bring Israel before the court, then this resolution is not only one that is going to help favor a two-state solution, it is one that is going to encourage and aggrandize those who are against the two-state solution. It reads, in a word, if you read this resolution, as an omnibus prosecutorial indictment and the bearing of false witness against Israel and the Jewish people. And so we have a responsibility to speak truth to power and to counter it wherever we may stand on the issue of settlements, because it is not simply about settlements, it goes far beyond that. And I regret only, because I must say this as well, that some 2 days before the UN Security Council resolution, when there was a United Nations General Assembly meeting that was convened in order to explore and implement mechanisms for the bringing of the war criminals in the Syrian war crimes to justice. Israel was absent from that General Assembly session, and our voice, which embodies Lo Tamod Adam Recha, should have been there. I understand some of the considerations, political considerations, which went into maybe not being there. The overriding consideration should have been here too, that we have to raise our voice, bear witness, give expression to those Jewish and universal values of Lo Tamod Adam Recha, and bring those war criminals to justice. Let me close very quickly with several other lessons. And in particular, the one that I want to mention is the danger of powerlessness and the danger of the vulnerability of the powerless. In other words, the Shoah was a standing assault on the vulnerable and the powerless. As Professor Friedlander wrote in his book on the origins of genocide, the first group singled out and targeted for mass killing were the Jewish disabled. And so we must always bear in mind our responsibility at all times to stand with the powerless and the vulnerable, to empower them not only in their voices, but in their action. And you know, when you look at the Shoah, it contained horrific crimes against women, where the crimes against women were not only in consequence of the genocide, but in fact attended it and were in pursuit of it. And so we have a responsibility today to promote and protect action against violence against women, which continues to be regrettably a horrific expression of violence in armed conflict, whether we talked about what is happening in Rwanda or in Syria, the mass rape in Syria, or the Boko Haram and the like. And also the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, namely children, where 1.5 million children, Jewish children, were murdered in the Holocaust. As Bialik says, there is simply no revenge for that kind of unspeakable mass murder and horror. How many universes therein were murdered and never to be born. And as my daughter, who's now 37, but when she was 15, she taught me one of the most important lessons I ever learned about the question of standing up for justice and standing against injustice. When she said to me, "Daddy, if you want to know what is the test of human rights in the world today, always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is it good for children? Is what is happening good for children?" And tragically, as we meet, children are being recruited for child soldiers, forced into themselves commission of crimes, at the same time as they are themselves the first victims and brutal victims of these war crimes and crimes against humanity. Two more lessons and I close. One, which I would be remiss if I did not mention, the important responsibility that we have to remember the survivors of the Shoah and those who amongst us today have been able to inspire us in the sense that those who witnessed the worst of crimes against humanity, or as Elie Wiesel put it, these were not just crimes against humanity, these were crimes against Jews by humanity. Those who witnessed the worst somehow found in the resources of their own humanity, in the anchorage of their own values, the capacity to rebuild their families as they rebuild the communities that they live in, as they rebuild our common humanity. That must also be part of Zachor. And the final thing to be part of Zachor is to always remember that the Shoah occurred not only for all the reasons that I gave in terms of state-sanctioned incitement to hate, the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity, the enduring legacy of anti-Semitism. We should always remember that it occurred tragically as well because of the powerlessness of the Jew. In other words, it's not the case, as we are sometimes told, that if there had not been a Holocaust, there would not have been a state of Israel. One can't speak of the state of Israel as compensation for 6 million murdered. It really is the other way around, and we should never forget that. That if there had been a state of Israel, there might well not have been a Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. And perhaps it might be useful to just end up with referencing what Elie Wiesel said at this point, because his voice cannot be here in person, but it was so compelling in how he described this last lesson. When he said, at least there would have been a place for refuge. At the Evian conference in 1938, which Rabbi Sachs spoke earlier and beyond, Europe was divided into two places. Those where the Jews could not leave or even live, and those where they could not enter. At least there would have been universes that could have been saved, an antidote to the radical evil of the Shoah. At least there would have been an old new state, an ancient homeland for an ancient people, as he put it, for the ingathering of exiles. At least there would have been a living expression of Zachor, of remembrance, as an antidote to the oldest and most enduring of anti-Semitism. At least there would have been a state founded, however imperfectly it may act, on tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, on justice, justice shall you pursue. The most profound of Jewish values. When I was growing up, I perhaps did not understand the profundity of that teaching of my father when he said to me that tzedek, tzedek, tirdof was equal, as he put it, to all the other values combined. This, as he put it, must be the Veshinamta Levanecha. This is what you must teach onto your children. But it was my mother, also Zichronah Livracha, when she heard my father say these things, would turn to me and say that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice becomes just a theoretical abstraction. And that's why we always have to remember the rescuers and the Raoul Wallenbergs, because they were able to confront evil, to prevail, and thereby to restore humanity. And so I end up with that fundamental Jewish value which underpinned everything that I was seeking to share with you today, that of tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, must we pursue. Thank you.